Welcome to WideAngle. I am Uday Bhaskar. Today's program looks at the just concluded John Kerry visit to India, where he met with his counterpart, Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj. And in the course of the next 30 minutes, we will review the status of the India-US bilateral relationship. To briefly recapitulate, this was Secretary Kerry's second visit to India as Secretary of State. Mr. Kerry was here in June 2013, soon after he assumed this office. The Kerry visit is important for two reasons. It is the first high-level political contact between the Obama administration and the Modi government. And second, the more substantive reason I would say, is that the India-US bilateral relationship is in a state of some stasis and perceived political neglect. Yet, to the credit of both ministers, they have been able to outline a meaningful potential agenda for the Modi-Obama meeting, which is scheduled later in September this year. To discuss this, as always, we have a very eminent panel. Dr. Rajiv Kumar, currently Senior Fellow at the Center for Policy Research, a very eminent economist. Rajiv, shall I add the word eminent strategist, given your wide experience?
Thank you.
And Ambassador Jayant Prasad, one of our most distinguished diplomats. He served extensively in the region and elsewhere. If I may, Jayant, could I start with you? You have looked at the India-US bilateral for over a decade. You were the Joint Secretary here at a very crucial time. How would you assess the Kerry visit, and would you agree that India-US is in need of some focused attention?
It's in need of resuscitation, Uday. And the Kerry visit has gone, I would say, satisfactorily, because I took a look at the joint statement. It is comprehensive and covers all the bases. India and the United States have, believe it or not, 35 issues on which they have separate dialogues. The problem, of course, always is in these dialogues that you don't judge it by the number of times you meet or the number of statements you read there, but the eventual outcomes. And that is where, despite the objective factors on both sides which impel a closer relationship between India and the United States, I think both countries need to exert a little more in their diplomacy and statecraft to make the relationship more meaningful. I would say that in this particular visit, there is one element which is curious, that Secretary of State John Kerry spoke in the context, of course, of the denial of visa to Prime Minister Narendra Modi, of it being done by another government. And when our Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj brought up the question of intrusive NSA surveillance, she spoke of continuity in foreign policy.
Yes.
So that was a curious element in these conversations.
But I'll come back to this in a moment. But Dr. Kumar, if I could ask you, trade, economy, commerce, technology, when the 2005 rapprochement, June 2005 civilian nuclear energy was mooted, there was a lot of expectation and hope. From 2005 to 14, 9 years down the road, there have been many disappointments. You have written extensively. So how would you characterize? The reason I'm asking is we now have a new hand on the tiller, as it were, in India, Prime Minister Modi and his political, shall we say, mandate. So do you think that there is hope to get over the stasis?
Well, the thing about the India-US relationship is that there is always hope, but the hope doesn't seem to be sort of get realized. I mean, this is a question of sort of we used to talk about India, a land of perpetual takeoff. So it seems imminent all the time, and then you kind of move sideways. And I've been wanting to sort of figure out as to why this is, and I think this is because we don't give enough emphasis on business to business relations in India-US relations. And whether we like it or not, US is a government, is a society which is in some sense driven by their business interests. And those businesses seem to have had a very mixed experience in India. we keep telling them that, look, all your US companies that are here have had very good experiences, so why are you bothered about it? What's your problem? Why are you complaining? We set up a private sector advisory group, we set up a CEOs forum, we set the trade policy, trade group, etc.
I recall you were in FICCI at one time and you tried all this.
Yeah, and I was in ICRIER and all of this was set up. There was this, all kinds of meetings, etc. Don't seem to move forward. And I think why? Because I think both countries somehow, because maybe they are democracies, have a great predominance of the domestic concerns in their relations with the other countries. And I think India and US, being both sort of countries which have, where the administrations have to be looking very sharply at the domestic concerns, domestic lobbies, etc., can't give in that inch or can't take that step which will allow the country to appear to have taken advantage
of the
other.
But I'll hold that thought. I'll come back to you, because one issue that often comes up in every discussion is that of visas and the American policy. I'll come back to you. Let me toss this to Jayant, because he has been looking at this very closely. Jayant, in the past, I've heard this phrase being used that India-US, the oldest democracy, the largest democracy, the defining relationship of the 21st century. Bill Clinton in his term had this thing about a staircase to the stars, etc. But yet there is that lingering, what to extend Rajiv's point, the myth of Sisyphus, that we think that we are making progress, but at the last minute, there is some kind of a setback. I want to put you on the spot, if I may, on this. With your considerable experience as a diplomat, we've had Devyani's case. Indian diplomats are steering this relationship. So do you think that there is hope in this particular 5-year tenure that we have with Mr. Modi?
Well, don't be taken in by Indian diplomats' exertions. Although I'm a diplomat and I defend the Foreign Service vigorously, the fact is that a relationship between India and the United States is driven right from the top. And it is the engagement at the top, when that flags, the relationship flags. So on the Devyani issue, which is a minor blip, it's closed, but it's symptomatic of the manner in which India and the US slipped back to the old ways of doing business with each other. And this was the fundamental, elemental change which took place when President George W. Bush took office. In the very first term of his presidency, there was the NSSP, Next Steps in the Strategic Partnership. And in that, we found that was the precursor to the nuclear deal. And Rajiv is right in saying that all politics in democracies tend to be local. But that's the problem that we face. The economies of both India and the United States slipped badly from 2008 onward. There was this crisis in the United States, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, and in India, growth flagged. And therefore, you see the impact or the repercussion directly on issues of direct consequence to Indians. For instance, the closing up of visas, restrictive practices, the new immigration bill. All this is a consequence of...
that famous line about jobs going from Buffalo to Bangalore.
Absolutely.
But Rajiv, can I bring you in on this? The visa issue, after Secretary Kerry's visit, Minister Swaraj had also raised it. How would you again sort of characterize this, and is there again a way ahead to say that we can find a modus vivendi?
No, I'm sure we can find a modus vivendi, and I think as a general point, let me say here that, and let me be sort of candid on this.
Blunt, Rajiv.
Blunt on this.
Yes.
You see, for me, India's interests are more vitally affected because of a good relationship or an improved relationship with the US than the US interests are in this Indo-US relation, right? So, to that extent, if we have a little bit of pride to swallow or an ego to sort of restrain ourselves with, I think it's worth doing that. Example, the visa issue. The fact is that there are hundreds of thousands of Indians working in the US. Making and our software, if you like, information industry took off because of the 2K issue and so on, and all the firms that we do. So the fact having recognized that now, if because of their domestic political concerns they have to put a cap on firms employing so many, we should understand that in the context of the fact that the number of visas that are being issued is going to be much larger than in the past. So what am I saying is that rather than make a huge song and dance about it,
be objective.
Be objective, and I think it is for our policy makers here to understand the lobbying and the local pressure that are coming out from our industry, but then to intermediate it in a manner that they don't lose sight of the bigger, the sort of longer term, the broader strategic issue,
sure,
which is that India stands to gain today where it is in its development stage by a better
and a closer relationship,
closer economic, commercial, technology relationship. And I think that is what very often comes in our way. And just as a last word is that, with all due respects to my diplomats, I think it'd be really much better if the diplomats could have a synergic relationship with our business people and then create a policy towards the US, because that together would be much more balanced in the two democracies than a G2G relationship, which often gets into high politics and into the egos and into the sort of
let me venture to suggest that if you look at the Modi model, as it were, the experience in Gujarat, you found this synergy between the bureaucracy and the private sector in terms of Gujarat's own progress. So I think perhaps the moot question this time is whether Prime Minister Modi would be able to bring that kind of both political directivity and the synergy. Why I'm raising this, and I hope Jayant will correct me if I'm wrong, when we did the India-US, June 2005, it was preceded by the Rumsfeld-Mukherjee agreement, the defense one. Actually, July was nuclear and defense was June. The sense one got, and I'm saying this as a student, as an analyst, someone who was trying to follow the politics behind it, in India, it was almost as if the big breakthroughs were being done by stealth, meaning at the political level, there was no one at that time who was willing to stand up and say that, like Rajiv says now, India needs to have this close and robust relationship with the United States. Do you think this is likely to change, and in terms of how Indian politics is going to orient itself, or are we going to see more of this stealth in trying to take the relationship forward but not own it in public?
I think it is gradually changing, because if you look at there is a disjunction in India between public perceptions at the popular level and government attitudes. And in the case of the United States in particular, this is very telling. If you look at all the polls that have been taken either by Gallup or by Pew, United States continues to enjoy high ratings within India. And therefore, I think the political enunciation is going to get altered over a period of time. There is no doubt about it.
Here, Uday, I think as in Gujarat, because you mentioned Gujarat, I think a better, more effective use of the Indian diaspora in the US would be of a great advantage. They are all very successful.
Sure.
They are they are in the business world. They have their networks, their connections, and I think a more effective use of their networks by our government organizations and agencies, if you like, can create a under the radar improvement in B2B relationships. And let me emphasize that it is actually an improvement in B2B relations which will give a keel, the level keel to support the G2G relationship. Our people to people relationships are very good.
I think that's very interesting. Programs should also throw up ideas. And I think, again, I say this as a student of the bilateral, I was tracking this from the early 90s, soon after the end of the Cold War. I think India's investment in the diaspora, we have the Pravas Bharati and various other initiatives. We are perhaps the only country that has a full-fledged ministry. Maybe there is a case for a very objective review of what the diaspora, particularly in North America, could do. But on that note, we'll take a quick break and I'll come back to you, Ambassador Prasad, to talk about the regional dynamic. Keep watching. We'll be back in a moment.
मैं तो सीधी सीधी बात करने वाला आदमी हूँ कि जिस जगह पे सत्य है वहाँ खुदा है, जिस जगह पे अहिंसा है वहाँ ईश्वर है।
Welcome back. We are discussing the Kerry visit and the India-US bilateral relationship. Ambassador Prasad, if you could dwell on the extended region, Southern Asia, from China and the SAARC countries, Afghanistan to Myanmar, current US policy, we've had this dissonance with them, disappointment with US policies over the years. Do you think that is receiving adequate attention?
From time to time, yes, but Indian compulsions sometimes are have to be read into new US officials, new US ministers, secretaries of state, secretaries of defense repeatedly, because with India's two main adversaries, Pakistan and China, we have to cover all contingencies. And this is something that sometimes is not recognized. The other element in the strategic partnership with the US, which is a bit of a problem, is that if you look at India's relations with the other great power, such as Russia or the former Soviet Union, they were steadfast in their support of Indian objectives in India's immediate contiguity. And that has not always been the case with the United States. And the latest case in point is what happened at the time of the run-up to the Bangladesh elections. The United States simply could not comprehend that the stakes in Bangladesh were for the soul of Bangladesh and for the possible creation, if things went wrong, of a new AFPAC for India in the eastern region. And then again, in Afghanistan, we have a common point of view. We want to stabilize the country. United States has spent blood and money in trying to do that. And we have contributed, of course, in our own way, without any troops on the ground in Afghanistan, and a low-key security relationship, which is has been limited so far to providing training to Afghan national security forces. But the manner in which United States policies towards Afghanistan evolve are completely driven by the internal dynamic, and there is very little prior consultation with India when major changes are announced or are in the offing. So there is very little opportunity for India to make an impact on the nature of those changes, to suggest ways in which things could be done. Because what the United States has done now is again having announced a troop level of 10,000, but eventual withdrawal in 2 years' time. The same thing that happened when the troop levels of the United States went up to a level of 100,000. But in the same breath, the US said that they were going to pull out in 2.5 years' time. And that led to the Taliban remark, which you recall, that you might have the watches, but we have the time.
So. Yeah. But Rajiv, if I could request you to look at the bigger picture, which is the nature of the relationship between the United States, China and India as this larger emerging macroeconomic triangle, and the strategic dissonance, India-China on one hand, US-China on the other, and how will that play out in the next decade plus?
Very clearly, Uday, this is the triangle, strategic triangle, which will perhaps emerge as the most important strategic trilateral in the world, going forward, unless of course we muff up our act completely. I mean, otherwise everybody expects that. And I think it is therefore very clear that each one of them, each one of us will try and be, if you like, equidistant between the other two.
True.
So that the other two believe that you are the one which is the swing state, in this relationship. And I think that is what calls for a very very nuanced, very clever, astute play of strategic autonomy here. India cannot, of course, be seen to be in either camp, because that will then preclude this sort of a situation, and at the same time cannot be seen to be having no stakes or no stand on its own. Now, my two bits here is this one, that while you are doing this, the most important thing for you is to get your domestic act together, because otherwise the two countries which are now much bigger than you and have been bigger than you will not take you seriously. So this is what that's the key to it, that you've got to get your growth rates up, you've got to get your strategic spending up, you've got to get your
legislation like
labor laws, inclusion, all of that up and going, and get on to the trajectory. The second one, though, is that there is a difference between the two countries, which one is sitting on your northern border.
True.
And has had conflictual relations with your father, and the other which is sitting at a much greater distance, which also, however, has had a history of supporting one of your adversaries.
True.
So, to that extent, my own understanding would be that if at all the stick has to bend, it could bend more towards the Atlantic than towards your northern neighbor. But with the same breath, I must add that there cannot be a situation where India would have to choose, and in any case cannot be a party to any sort of front line
kind of a choice,
and a kind of front line status that you might, either of the countries might want to, China or the US might want to confer upon you. We have to say no thanks, we don't want to do that. But however, as long as you help us with our domestic issues, both are more than welcome, and we will facilitate your entry into the South Asian subcontinent.
So, this I think is perhaps at one level both a political and a diplomatic challenge, which is how do you manage the contradictory tenor? There is the imperative of globalization and all the trade, commerce related issues. But to again extend Rajiv's formulation, that historically if you look at 40 years, both the United States and China have acted in a manner that has been adversarial to India. The specific case study is Pakistan, its nuclear weapons, missiles and so on. So, since Rajiv in passing also mentioned strategic autonomy for India, the reality check is that 70 to 80% of our critical military inventory is still imported. Now, you were there I think in South Block when the first discussions took place, and then we finished with the Ashton Carter blueprint. You think there is any hope of taking that forward, or again will it fall prey to the issues that we have identified?
No, I think we have no option but to take it forward. I don't know whether the terms of the agreement are going to be the same or they are going to be altered. But if you look at how India-US military to military exchanges have developed, they have, despite all the problems we've had on the political side, these exchanges have prospered. In dealing with the triangular relationship between India, China and the United States, India suffers from a strategic disadvantage in the sense that 10 years ago the general assumption was that the gap in comprehensive national power between United States and China was roughly the same as the gap between India and China. And now the tragedy is that the gap between China and USA is closing, and the gap between India and China has widened. And you can see this in the fact that the United States government under President Obama started out by a kind of G2 kind of embrace of China. There was this idea of giving a strategic reassurance to China, which didn't of course happen. And both United States and India will continue to have an adversarial relationship with China. But just as United States is not going to provoke China beyond a point, so also India. So our policies in effect of both India and United States mirror each other, although we come from a completely different point of view.
I just want to come in here because you mentioned this very important thing. You cannot aspire to be a global power if 70 to 80% of your strategic equipment is imported. You're dependent. Now, what is the way forward on this?
That's exactly what I want to ask you. Saying FDI 49%, will it work?
It won't. You see, and this is where we needed
Please
to solve.
Bluntly.
It will not work because our bid to create national champions is an elusive goal at the moment, because in doing so, we sacrifice both our objectives of maximizing employment and maximizing production of strategic equipment within the country. And I think to that extent, I had been sort of advocating this for a while, and that you got to go beyond 51, if not to 75%. Otherwise, those who've got frontline technology, and the argument made by our larger companies that, well, India is such a big market that they will come in any case, and this 49% will give us the leverage to get better, the transfer technology. I don't think it's a valid one. And just one last quick point is that our missile program, the BrahMos, was done by a whole lot of small and medium enterprises around Hyderabad, which were into precision engineering. Now, they are hungry for more projects.
And hopefully that can be taken forward. But I really agree with you. I think Ashton Carter and that blueprint needs to be seen again in great detail. But on that note, the India-US bilateral is perhaps the most critical bilateral relationship for India, as our discussion had just borne out. It's across the spectrum, from the political and strategic to trade, economy and technology, and also the diaspora, as we have just identified. Next week, India will welcome US Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, and hopefully some of the more important security and defense related issues will be flagged, thereby providing a meaningful agenda for the Modi-Obama meeting scheduled for late September. Ambassador Prasad, Dr. Kumar, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. And we remain hopeful that there is a way ahead. Thank you for watching. This program will be back next week. Till then, goodbye.